off in just a couple of seconds. Thank you so much for joining us at our event today. So feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat. Let us know where in the world you might be joining us from. And we're going to begin in just about 30 seconds. So thank you again for joining us today. And I'm coming from sunny, finally spring-ish New York City. So let us know where in the world you might be coming from. And we're going to get started in just a second. Great. Love seeing people. Miami, Florida, Toledo, Ohio. Wonderful. Okay, let me go ahead and start to kick things off here. Very excited to be having you all join us for today's conversation. And today we're going to be talking about data-driven inclusion, measuring what matters. And I'm very excited for us to kind of go into this conversation. We've got a great panel here that you're going to hear from all more in just 1 second. Screen sharing is not my friend right now, but let's try that again. Okay, there we go. Thank you again so much for joining us. My name is Rob, and I am the Director of Events and Marketing at PowerToFly. Very excited for you to be joining us here today. Just want to share here our code of conduct on the screen so you can take all a look so we have a great conversation. One thing I just wanted to point out is that the content shared during PowerToFly's events is for informational purposes only, does not constitute legal advice, and for specific legal guidance, please consult a qualified attorney. Also happy to say that today's event is eligible for SHRM credits. So if you are a member of SHRM, please take a screenshot of this screen. That code is 25-GXJJ3. So hopefully that can continue on your continued education journey there as well. And just a couple of words about Power to Fly. We really help organizations attract, hire, retain, and develop top diverse talent. Our mission is to fast track economic equity by upskilling and connecting underrepresented talent to roles in companies that care. And we are very excited to always present events like this one. We actually have another event that everyone might be very interested in next week, all about reaching, retaining, and recruiting talent. So check out your inboxes for more information on that one. But without further ado, I'd love to introduce today's amazing panel. We have Rachel Vicente, who is the founder and CEO of Rachel Vicente Consulting, specializing in anti-racist practices, leadership, coaching, and organizational transformation. With a background as a nonprofit leader and educator, she brings a values-aligned approach to advising, coaching, and facilitating. And based in Miami, she also is passionate about wheel throwing and cherishes her role as an aunt to 6 nieces and nephews. So, Rachel, thank you so much for being here today. We also have Selene Turner, who is a partner at Advantage Performance Group, a seasoned HR professional with over 20 years of experience driving talent strategies across Fortune 500 companies in industries such as cruise lines, technologies, manufacturing, and financial services. She's passionate about fostering inclusive workplaces, leading cultural transformations, and sharing her expertise as a global advisor and speaker. So thank you so much and welcome. Next up is June Kara Christian. Dr. June Kara Christian is a leadership strategist, executive coach, and founder of Pineapple Lampshade, a bespoke consultancy that helps leaders and co-founders build powerful and lasting communication. Rooting in a humanist philosophy, her work centers authentic leadership, joy, and transformation as tools for dismantling systematic bias. Welcome to June. And last but not least, my amazing colleague, Sienna J. Brown, who is the VP of Growth at Power to Fly. Her mission is to build a new wave of leadership, focused on inclusion and intention in the workplace so that every individual has an equal opportunity to reach their potential. So thank you all so much for being here today. I'm very excited to dive more into this conversation and hear from all of you as we get going. So thank you so much. And first up, I just kind of wanted to kind of talk a little bit about what's happening right now. So, of course, we know that there is a great deal of um, uncertainty that's out there in the world. We're kind of hearing certain guidelines that are coming from the federal level and from the presidential level, and this is causing a lot of confusion that's out there. So we have a lot of leaders on the line who are looking kind of for advice. How do they steer their organizations during this time of confusion, especially around DEIB topics and inclusionary topics? So, what advice can we give them? What guidelines can we give them? Because, as I was saying actually before we went live, one thing that I love to always reiterate is one of the things that is happening in the government right now is these are guidelines. These are not laws. So, we should really think of these as guidelines. So, what guidelines can we put out there into the world in terms of data-driven inclusion? Sienna, since you're my colleague here from Power to Fly, maybe I can send things over to you to kick us off.
For sure. Thank you, Robin. Welcome. And I'm really happy to have all of you here today and to also be with all these amazing panelists. I think I'll try to be brief, but there's a couple of things that I think are really important. Oftentimes, when we are in times of chaos and or uncertainty with different regulations and guidelines that are being put out, I think something that often happens is we run into reactive mode. So a lot of organizations right now are reacting. What should we say? What should we do? Do we talk about our inclusion efforts? Do we not? And I think something that's really important, not just for you all as leaders, but then also for your employees, your customers, and your brand as well, is thinking about what are your organizational core values. And when you're thinking about compliance, thinking about not just leading with compliance, but also what are the values that we stand by? What is our mission, and how are we allowing that to guide our work outside of what might be the legal recommendations or the legal requirements that we'll see now and in the future? And we really learn how to anchor not just our words, but our actions and our values, not just mandates. It allows for us to be able to go much further in regards to who are we as an organization and who are we as leaders. And not only that, but what do we stand for? Not just now, but in the long term as well. And the other thing that I would say that's really important for us to consider is right now, the term quote unquote DEI is something that has become a buzzword and also something that is very polarized at the moment. But in reality, when we think about it, is how do we care about people? And recognizing that each individual is diverse in their own ways. And that can be as simple as, are you left-handed or are you right-handed? To make it as non-polarizing as possible, but really thinking about how are you building in inclusion in the way that you lead, in the way that you hire, and the way that you build teams and retain them, and really focusing not just on what are the one-off initiatives or statements that you're saying, but how are you embedding that in your day-to-day actions, and how are you embedding that in the way that you treat your employees, your clients, your customers, and essentially the communities that you work with on a day-to-day basis.
I love that. Thank you, Sienna. Yeah, I think we often talk about here at Power to Fly not having that one size fits all strategy. And I think that's one thing with kind of the term DIB or diversity or inclusion that has been like a very umbrella term and it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Len, I'll throw things over to you. Same kind of question. How can organizations prioritize diversity and inclusion while staying compliant with these ever evolving policies and guidelines?
So one of the things I do in my HR profession is I always look back to, okay, what is my true north in terms of compliance, right? So I would like to understand my foundation, what I need to first definitely comply with and kind of have that almost is a sturdy foundation that I can put everything, like building a house ground and then build from there and then connect to the strategy of the organization. So I think to Sienna's point, I agree with everything she said, is really going back to why is this important anyway? Why did we start these initiatives in the first place? Going back to the basics and really honing in on why it's important to the company, to the organization, and why should we care? And then from there, I think then things will fall into its place. I believe there's so many good things around inclusion. To your point, Rob, is team effectiveness, effective leadership, like everything that we know that creates a good, strong, healthy culture is resides really, if you think about it, all around really valuing people, making sure people feel belong to where they are and feeling themselves to thrive and to be the best they can be in a workplace. So if we go back to the basics, fundamentals of better workplaces and creating strong cultures, I think that's what it's all about.
Yes, that I love that. And we've heard that from some other folks that we've spoken with, kind of that back to basics quality and really looking at, okay, like what does that mean to have a culture, as you said, maybe embracing that word culture throughout all of its different meanings. So thank you. And I'd love to send this next question, Rachel, over to you, kind of going a little more in the weeds with kind of what I was just saying, which is how can HR and DEIB leaders effectively communicate the importance of diversity and inclusion when they're faced with political pushback and legal challenges, especially around diversity quotas and targets?
Yeah, great question. And excited to be here in partnership with you all. I think that what the two wonderful ladies before me shared is really important. And so I always invite people to step back and take a moment to think about, like, what does DEIB really mean? And I think that people are getting lost in a lot of the acronyms. There's many different versions of DEIB and different meanings. And I think that people forget what it really means, which is about people and creating spaces for people to thrive. But most importantly, when I think about DEIB and what I center in my work, it's about power sharing. And so we know that there are systems of oppression like racism, sexism, classism, ableism, etc. That's about power hoarding. So people with resources continuing to hold their resources, making decisions about what's normal and good, right? So when we have DEIB priorities in place, we are saying we want to investigate policies and practices that essentially disrupt the status quo and allow for people to thrive. So we want for people to thrive. And when you power share or when you plan for the margins, you are essentially saying, I want to think about those on the outside. So I'm going to give you two concrete examples. Let's start first with this idea of a bereavement policy. Everyone on this call has a bereavement policy. But currently, if you were to say, what's your bereavement policy? You might think about it in the traditional sense. My bereavement or family is the traditional parents and my children. Well, what that does, it actually eliminates for those who have a more expansive view, right? Those who might be queer, those who might be like me, I'm Cape Verdean. We define family as my grandparents, my family, my nieces and nephews, again, those that don't have children. So when we don't consider and ask ourselves, who is being left out of policies and practices, we do not create spaces for people to thrive. And so I wanted to give a concrete example because that is actually something that you can do in your own place. You can say, how are our existing policies and practices creating places for people to thrive? And our diversity targets and our quotas, what we're saying is that we want to understand and track who is thriving, who is not thriving, who is being included in the conversation, and who is not. And so there's many, many ways that I'll get into later. But again, I think what is really important is what was said is to center around the why. We want people to thrive, to ultimately have a good experience at the workplace.
I love that. And that's such a great example, Rachel, because certainly like even spousal families are often not included in that. I remember when my husband's father passed away, like I was lucky that my employer was accepting of that, but at the same time, yes, it was not actually included in there. So I love that. And I think the other thing you're making me think is when we ran our What Talent Wants survey at the beginning of the year, the leadership gap was one of the biggest things that folks talked about and trying to find ways of closing that gap, including get professional upskilling. So I think what you mentioned there very much spoke to all that. And I love to send this next question over to you, June, and then to Rachel and Selene to get your thoughts as well. But many organizations focus on representation metrics, right? We heard a lot of this, especially kind of in 2020. But how can we measure progress towards a more inclusive and supportive workplace without getting lost in the numbers there? Because some of these numbers have been especially things that are being targeted by the new federal guidelines. What key indicators of success go beyond demographics? So, June, love to send things over to you first and then hear from the rest of the panel.
Absolutely. I think first, let me say I'm so happy to be here with everyone. What I think is really top of mind in terms of these key indicators is around the story, right? So, what do we understand? How are we communicating with each other? What is true for us? So, numbers can tell you who's represented, right? But beyond who's represented, we need to understand what experience those folks are having and collectively, what experience are we having? 52% of employees of color say that their company's DEI efforts feel performative, and that's from the Harvard Business Review this year. Or I'm sorry, last year. And so, if that's the case, if employees are feeling as though these efforts are performative, how do we understand their story? What do we understand that they're thinking about this performance? And when we can root that in a collective story, I think we are communicating better and understanding how folks are coming to the conversation. And I think also one of the things that really should be measured, and I think you can put it on a performance review, you can put it on something that you send to the entire company, but I think also in smaller team units, what does belonging look like? How are we tracking belonging? And there are actual metrics that track belonging. So it's not this kind of lofty, we want everybody to feel like they belong, right? So now what you've got is the guidelines and what the law is alongside that story.
I love that. And I love the idea of kind of getting more granular there because a lot of, I think the focus is on what is the company-wide approach to this rather than going, okay, I'm a part of the marketing team. What does it mean to belong as part of the marketing team or the engineering team and getting more granular there. I love that. Let's hear from both Selene and Rachel on this. So Selene, I'll throw things over to you first.
Sure. So I'd like to add on to the conversation here. So there are actually studies out there. So just doing my PhD, of course, coming out of a research background here, I've studied inclusion last 5 years. And one of the things that it really amazed me as a practitioner myself in talent management, talent development, and HR is sometimes how we overlook some of the research studies that gives us the data to actually go back and use those studies to prove our point. So if you look at the studies proven over and over again is performance and direct link to feeling of inclusion. It's been proven over and over again. People who feel included, meaning feeling of my ideas are heard and implemented. I feel that my unique contributions are actually heard, being visible. So those are the things that we actually, if you think about it, we do include these in our engagement surveys. Many engagement surveys nowadays ask about feeling included and feeling belonging. And if you go back to connecting the studies, which is feeling included and belong, and how people use their extra effort, give their all, give their best, and increased engagement, less turnover, all those metrics coming together could really, going back to the story, power of story, could tell a huge, powerful story to the leaders, to the executives, or to the world out there. That why this is so important that we do create a supportive culture, that people do want to bring their all and ideas are heard. If you think about innovation, continuous improvement, those are critical pillars for any company out there right now, trying to get ahead in the competition, marketplace, in the global environment. These are critical things that our executives are thinking about. How do I get my people to be more innovative, to be more growth oriented? And these are the things that we can then back into and think about, how do we get there? Well, we have actually, if we create the right environment, people do bring in their ideas and do become a more innovative company or culture. So those are the things I think we can latch onto in addition to the representation metrics. Feeling of inclusion and belonging, those are very relevant data that can be drawn from the engagement surveys.
Thank you. And maybe you could also in the chat add in, Shasta was asking, could you provide some references for this research? So maybe if you can respond to them and let them
Sure.
know, that would be great. And Rachel, love to hear from you on this same question.
Love that. Before I answer, I would also include, if you are not familiar, McKinsey does an annual survey called Women in the Workplace. It is the most comprehensive survey that looks at women's experience in corporate America. Obviously, it's a US-based experience, but it's also, my focus is a lot around women of color's experience. It's the most concrete that goes over women of color's experience as well too. They just released a 10-year anniversary report. And one thing I want to name is that institutions are investing less in mentorship, leadership development, and all of the institutional supports for women now than 10 years ago. So that is an important thing to know and understand, that the culture has been shifted for there. So I'll drop it in the chat after I share. But so one of the things that I want to name is that yes, there are many other ways that organizations can look at effectiveness and health and culture beyond recruiting and onboarding, which is, of course, what's been most scrutinized. And I want to say something that's really important is, as I'm going through some of these examples, you want to think about what is your goal or what is your priority, because you want to cut the data in the way that centers what you are hoping to accomplish. So what are the demographics that you want to focus on? So I obviously am focused on anti-racism and equity, and people often think about that in two ways. Maybe we're thinking about interracial, what is the race and what is the sex, but things that are also really important is title, tenure of a company, right? Really thinking about beyond the institutional power and privilege that a person holds, what's the positional power and what's the differences of a person's experience at an organization, given how long they've worked there or the power that they hold in their title. That is an important place to start for how to build more inclusive cultures. Because if you don't analyze it from a from a subgroup team's perspective, from an organizational perspective, you're going to miss something. And if you can't look at it with that level of intentionality, well, you can't disrupt it. I always say things like, if you can't name it, you can't disrupt it. And so I always encourage people to think about it from a life cycle of an employee, right? So recruitment. The first question that I would ask is, what are the pipelines that you are seeking new employees from? Where are they at? If you're not getting many diverse people, like I say to institutions, maybe there's an engineer and tech. Are you partnering with HBCUs or HSIs, Hispanic serving institutions, right? Like, I'm just giving you an example right there. But one of the ways is looking at recruitment. What are the pipelines? Onboarding. What is the experience of employees in their onboarding? Are expectations being clearly set? When we're looking at, okay, now an employee has joined the company, the first question I always ask is like, who's having the experience that we want to have? Who feels like they are being cared for by their company? Who feels like their performance is being impacted? Again, you can use that through surveys like Culture Amp. Other questions I think is super important. Who is being developed? Who are the managers that are most effective and their employees are like having strong gains? Who is allowed to dissent publicly and who is not? Similar in promotion, who is being promoted? Who is getting pay increases? How much? Who are the people that are getting title increases? Who is receiving outside professional development? When we think about retention, who is being retained? What are the strategies that we have? What's their perspective on that? And then separation, who is exiting? So when I just walked through an employee's life cycle, as you can see, the onboarding and the retaining is a small percentage. And I think, June, your language around a story, it's a very, very small story of an employee's experience with us. And so one of the ways that I always encourage is to think more expansively around what is the experience of my employee once they're here. And again, really important, who is exiting and why, and how can we look back to their employee journey to understand why. But I'll pause, but just wanted to give some very concrete questions that you could ask to understand what are the data and how can we, cut that.
I love that. Yeah, because I think a company, if you are looking at kind of data, your data could look really great in terms of representation if you're looking at the company as a whole. But yeah, what if you're looking at the number of non-white individual contributors versus non-white managers? And I love kind of getting more there. Some questions coming in for the audience, so I'd love to kind of weave them in because they're great. And Sienna, maybe I can throw this first question over to you to answer first, and then love to hear from anyone else on the panel. But Stephanie was asking, they would love to learn a bit more about how HR leaders can respond to requests for ROI on specific DEI initiatives like ERG. So especially as some of the, let's say, these traditional like metrics might be more frowned upon as the guidelines go on, people still want ROI. They still want to see what's happening. So what would you say to Stephanie?
Hey, Stephanie. It's also lovely to see your face. I think this is Stephanie Castro. I think the first thing that I would say to you is before thinking about what is the story that you're going to present, understand who you're speaking to. And this also goes back to what the other three women were just saying in regards to some of their strategies. I think something that's really important, especially when thinking about making change in an organization, understanding the organizational readiness. Because I think that that is something that often happens where we as individuals or leaders might be at a level 10 in regards to how much we want to push the needle, where C-level or executives might be at a level 5. So something that I always say is number one, what is the organizational readiness that you're seeing? And that can be looked at through data, through hearing from other employees' experiences. But the second thing that I would say is understanding the decision makers. And so I say that because your CFO, your CEO, and your CHRO might want to see 3 very different answers on what does ROI mean to them, right? And so I think being able to understand that readiness, being able to understand who are the core decision makers that you're speaking to, and then also not just looking at data through a lens of data, but going back to what June was saying, what is the story that you're sharing in regards to that data? So you might be saying, okay, how are we looking at specific DEI initiatives like ERGs? Maybe you're tying that to how does the level of inclusion and belonging within those ERG groups are leading to longer retention for specific types of employees? How is that leading to professional development and career growth for individuals who might be holding leadership opportunities? How are the individuals within ERGs, right, tying it back to the bottom line of the business might be delivering more effective, contributing to revenue in different ways. And so I think it's really taking a step back and understanding, and that can be as simple as sending out a quick three question survey to the individuals who are going to be the decision makers. What matters most to you? Why does it matter? And then being able to tie that story back to what they really want to hear. And I think this happens often, especially as we're trying to prove ROI, where we just share a lot of data points, create a really beautiful spreadsheet or spreadsheet or presentation, and then it gets lost. And you have to present 5, 7, 10 times because your message is getting lost because it's not actually what they want to hear. So I would say doing some of that work first to really be able to understand what matters to them. And then you tie that into, and here's the why from the perspective and the insights that you've gotten from your point of view. I hope that helps.
Yes, thank you so much. That was great. Love to throw this out. Anyone else on the panel like to jump in?
I'd like to also piggyback off of that. One thing also to think about what is the context of the organization, going back to what Sienna was just saying, right? So going back to what is it that we're trying to do? What is our leaders, what is it they're thinking about the most? So I'll give you another example around innovation, because for the last few companies I worked for, innovation was always top of mind, and talent management and talent development would always have to create something to move the needle in the organization. So one way to look for ERGs, for example, specifically, that can help with those. So thinking about ERGs, how do they become part of the strategy? How can they help with the community they create to help us to create a psychological, more psychological safe environment for ideas to flourish? Can they help with some of the initiatives to bring about ideas that will move our company forward? So these are like design thinking, a little bit putting design thinking into it, and maybe back engineering, looking at what are we trying to solve for the organization. And 9 out of 10, it's about culture, right? Because we know that culture eats strategy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And so how can we, as HR professionals, talent development, all talent acquisition leaders here, how can we back engineer, put our tools into its place and say, okay, so let's think about this the other way around. Here is what we're trying to do in this organization. How can these different DIB initiatives that we created, which is usually around culture, can help with that effort? And that is your ROI. I'll give you a very quick example and then I'll pass on. In one of the organizations I worked for, one of the name of the game was transformation. And so they look to us to see how we can create innovative thinking back into the organization, because it wasn't there for the last 20 years. And so one of the things that we did, among many initiatives, we created an innovation contest, create a very psychologically safe environment, which we suspected from the engagement survey was missing in the culture. And came about 29 ideas, out of one which saved the company $4 million. So there is the ROI, right there. And then the initiative created $4 million savings in the company, and that can directly tie to the initiative that HR was leading. So if that makes sense, wanted to share that ROI question.
Well, I'd say $4 million is a pretty good return on investment. So, anyone else want to comment?
I just wanted to add, kind of to piggybacking on what Sienna said, don't be afraid when you are asking those key decision makers and you've got what they're looking for in terms of data, don't be afraid to draft your own narrative, right? Because they don't know what they don't know. And so you've got a dearth, a wealth of information that's both quantitative and qualitative. I think Rachel gave a great list of data points, right, that can tell a story. So help to contextualize what it is that they're looking for inside of a broader story. So if you're seeing for example, if you're seeing turnover in a particular department, but it started to slow down, and that's like in an engineering department, right? Because it's a revolving door often in engineering, right? In different places. But if you're able to say, we've slowed this down immensely and we've saved money here, or we're increasing the tenure of the folks who are here, if you're able to show them this may not necessarily be what you think it is, here's some context, which means I think getting into the data and looking at it and trying to understand the complete picture as opposed to data points that are satisfactory but may not tell the full story.
Yeah, I love that. And I love kind of the going back to this storytelling idea because I think like maybe controversial statement, but I feel like sometimes in like DEIB over the last few years, we haven't done the best job in storytelling. The storytelling sometimes has been like, why do we need this? Because you have to. Like everyone says we need it, right? But like we're not always saying, oh, telling the whole story, how can this affect the company? How can this affect individuals there? So I love this kind of going back to that. I want to take Jenny's question. Rachel, maybe I can send this over to you first, and then anyone else who wants to add in. Jenny, she was asking efforts to ensure that performance reviews are fair is critical to equity and belonging, but I'm curious for folks who are at much smaller orgs, so less than 100 people, how to combat the matching tension of lack of promotion opportunities and staff seeing growth in place or growth out of the org as inequitable. So yeah, any advice in general for smaller orgs that might not have the resources that some of the big folks have?
That's a great question. And I personally worked before I was launched my business in smaller organizations and work with sometimes organizations as small as 20. So I think what is really important is I'm going to share a personal belief. Knowledge sharing is a way of living into equity. Withholding knowledge is a way of perpetuating inequity. So one of the things that I see often is that there is, because of fear of conflict or different fears, people do not share the transparency or acknowledge the current reality, which is as following. We are a smaller institution. We only have, because of your culture is so great that people love to stay, that you don't have a lot of turnover. And because of maybe budgetary reasons, we don't have the ability to expand. I think being able to share that allows for people to make decisions that are best for them. Oftentimes, the tension that I see in smaller institutions is that the people with power, the decision makers, have this knowledge, for example, that at the end of this fiscal year, we're not going to have the ability to have any promotions or any open roles. And instead of sharing that when they personally know, it is not shared. And they might see one person be promoted because they're so wonderful and that's an individual. And that is where people start making their own narratives because they don't have the level of information that is happening. So that's part one around like name it, say it, talk about it, lean into it. Because that is a way of building trust. Transparency is a way of building trust and is a way of living into your equity commitments and your values. The second thing is to actually do an analysis of promotion over the last 5 to 10 years, because you might perceive that there wasn't promotions, but maybe the promotions that you aren't perceiving was all C-suite leaders or people in power just getting a new title. You might not call it a promotion, but people that have lower positional power might interpret it as such. So actually, my thing that I say all the time is go to the data. What is the concrete data saying? And then being able to extrapolate from there. So again, another transparency thing. Hey, we did a data analysis over the last 10 years. These types of departments are experiencing ability to grow in L&D. These traditionally haven't. And again, letting your employees make the decision for themselves. I think what happens is we want to retain employees so much that we're like, let's not share anything and we'll hope. But again, people are using their smart brain and their analysis to see what is happening, and they're filling in gaps potentially with misinformation. And so that is something directly that I would name from my end.
I love that. And even when you look at much bigger companies, I think a lot of it has come through like a lack of transparency. So I
Yeah.
think it's definitely good for small companies and big companies too. But
Yes.
anyone else want to comment on anything for smaller orgs, less than 100 folks?
Yeah, I'll hop in really quickly. So both within our organization at Power to Fly, as well as a lot of the organizations that we've worked and partnered with, something that I often see in smaller companies, plus one to everything Rachel was just saying, and I think to add on to that as well, understanding what your employees value, right? Because right now we're talking about promotion opportunities. When I hear this, I'm saying, is it title? Is it more money? Is it more opportunity? Is it more alignment with their skills? And so there's so many different ways that we can look at what does career development look like and being able to honor that. And I think a lot of my personal mission has to do with how can we create space for more presence, more purpose, and more people first leadership without compromising performance and impact, right? All organizations want to be able to drive towards the bottom line, but when we're able to understand, okay, maybe for Rachel, her having a promotion opportunity might mean she has more flexibility. I'm creating some, I don't know you, but I was like, I'm creating a potential story. What I do know I love, but maybe for Rachel, promotion means being able to have more access to flexibility and time to spend outside of the office for X responsibilities, right? Fantastic. How can we lean into that? Maybe for June, this looks like how am I able to heighten up my impact, not just in my role, but with a much wider skill set that I might be able to contribute in different places in the organization. And so I think something that's really important is understanding what your employees mean when they say that they're looking for promotion opportunities, and then also being able to understand how are individuals being able to tie their work to a bigger purpose or a bigger picture. Because something else that often happens is we're talking a lot about culture, we're talking a lot about psychological safety, but I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about cognitive dissonance that also happens in organizations. You might have different groups of people saying, we're doing a great job. That data looks fantastic. Everything's fine. And then at the end of the day, you have a much wider group that doesn't feel the same. And so I always go back to being able to, yes, create the story, look at the data, do the storytelling, but then also, for lack of a better term, call a spade, right? And what I mean when I say that is being able to say, going back to the transparency, we might not be ready yet for more promotion opportunities, but we're willing to take the consequences of what that means, right? And so I think, again, it really goes back to, yes, that transparency and communication, but then also actually creating space as leaders and as organizations to hear the feedback that we're getting. And I think being able to hear the feedback that we might get will allow for even more psychological safety when we're able to have that same kind of ownership within, especially smaller organizations as well, where there might be opportunities within or outside of that workforce to be able to grow and really to be able to develop the skills and the opportunities that people need in their careers.
Yeah, I think the other word along with storytelling that I'm hearing so much from you all is feedback. And someone mentioned Culture Amp before. There's lots of great platforms that you can use to gather feedback, or of course, just having one-on-ones. I think it kind of goes back to what we were also saying, not only looking at a org approach to this, but a departmental approach to this as well. I know there's some other questions coming in, so feel free to add some more questions into the chat so we can get to as many as we can in our last 15 minutes. But since we're on the topic of communication, June, I'd love to send a question over to you, which is given your focus on authentic communication, how can organizations transparently communicate their inclusion efforts in a way that aligns with legal constraints, yet still demonstrates commitment to that cultural change?
I absolutely love this question. I think something that's really important, right? Edelman found in their research that 61% of employees actually trust their employers more than they trust the government. And so I think when you think about that, how much trust employees place in their employers, and also recognizing that some folks are taking that with a grain of salt. Transparency isn't everything, but if you are seeking to establish a safer environment, if you are seeking to increase trust, share what you can, right? And so I think there is a conversation to be had with leadership with regard to what are the things that we can share and what are the things that we can't share so that those boundaries are exceptionally clear, so that when you go to your team, you can tell folks as they are sharing with their teams even, right? Here's what I know. I'm not trying to keep you in the dark. Here are the things that I can share. And you can ask questions with the caveat, if I can't share that, then I'm going to tell you that I can't share that, right? And so while there may still be a thirst for information, there is an understanding that I respect you as a human being enough to tell you what I can tell you so that whatever apprehension, fear, concerns, or feedback you want to offer, you can do that now, and you know that I'm ready to receive it. I think the other thing that a lot of leaders get confused, silence doesn't equal neutrality. So people are very astute human beings. We all know, one, when we're being lied to, we also know when information is being withheld. And so, if there is an opportunity for a leader to say, we are having a number of discussions, this is the information that we have for you. I will tell you, to give some more depth to that. And one of the leaders that I was talking with, the company was approaching a reduction in force, and the leader had a very close-knit team, and there were folks on the team who were going to be let go. There's a conflict of interest there. There's some dissonance with regard to how much of this do I share and how much do I have to keep back for legal reasons before the reduction is actually shared. So what we ended up doing is having that conversation. What can you share? Tell your employees, the folks on your team, what you can share with them. If there's going to be an impact, you don't have to say 3 of the 5 folks on this team are leaving, but what you could say is, I want to make sure that everybody here has their resume up to date. I'm happy, right, to look over your resume, or to, you should send it to somebody, but what can you do that supports the humanity of the people that you support? How can you ensure that they have the safest landing possible with the most information that they can have?
I love this. Yeah, no, that thank you so much. Yeah, we tell people all the time when they're at Power to Fly events too, because people say, "Oh, I get it. If I get a tough question, like, and should I ignore it?" It's like, don't ignore it. Just say, "You know what? I don't have the answer to that right now. I'm going to take your info. We're going to get back to you." That way you're acknowledging it. I think going back to what you're saying, treating folks as human beings. And Selene, I love to throw things over to you because we're talking sometimes about stuff that's happening in the US here, but as a global advisor, how can we approach data-driven inclusion while accounting for varying inclusion goals across different countries and regions? I know we work a lot often with companies that are based in APAC, for example, and for them, they're really just looking at gender equity right now. They're not necessarily looking at other factors we might in the US. So how should folks approach that?
I think what you said is exactly right, Rob. So knowing your population. So in my global roles, I work directly with the local legal authorities, legal HR professionals, and legal talent, or local HR professionals, to understand the context, as well as what is again, going back to, we need to first comply, and then build on the strategy on top of that. So looking at what is the minimal or the requirement in that country, what do they care about the most, understanding the local culture context a little bit more. There are some things that we need to track, for example, in Latin America countries, that you have to actually, as an employer, sometimes employ people with disabilities at a certain percentage. So there's your tracking. You have to track those things, and you have to actually prove at the end of every year when you go through auditing. So there's the reality of tracking has to happen. You have to have some percentages in place in some countries to even be able to do any trade with them or have an office in their countries. There's trades off, some looking at the cost benefit analysis. Some of them could be a lot more expensive than having an entity in that country. And there's definitely, that's the business decision that has to be made on the cost benefit analysis. But I would look at first those kind of like an inventory of which country requires what. Let's kind of understand where we are at, where we are operating. And then let's take a look at also our strategy around inclusion in general. What is right for this organization? What do we value, going back to the values conversation, the strategy conversation, and what's right, what inclusion means. And then kind of marry those two to make sure that we are first, of course, complying with the requirements of each country and be respectful of those cultures. I think cultural competence comes into play for many HR professionals here, understanding the true context of what diversity means. It may mean many different things in many countries. Knowing and understanding and being knowledgeable about, I think, is a key. Knowledge is power, to make sure we're not disrespectful to those cultures, and also being more knowledgeable about, in general, how do we approach those maybe initiatives in those countries, right? What kind of initiatives do we need to take into consideration when we think about creating more supportive, inclusive leadership, inclusive team effectiveness, especially when it comes to cross-cultural collaboration and those cross-cultural teams that we have. What are some of the things that we need to, initiatives to put in place to increase their cultural competence? And so they can understand one another and their context, and creating a more effective team. I think one of the biggest things that I get passionate about when we talk about inclusion is it's also creating effective teams that value one another, that have fun with one another, they produce, and they have a really a place where they can be themselves. So I think talking about inclusion, it's all about team effectiveness and managerial effectiveness. And marrying those two across the globe, I think, goes back to, again, knowing local culture context is critical. Having person that knows that context, I think, by your side as you're thinking about those initiatives and what you need to do in those countries.
Thank you so much. And Rachel, you were just putting into Terry Ann's question there, so I'd love actually maybe you can just vocalize some of that as well, because when Terry Ann was saying, when it comes to filling critical workforce gaps, what data do you suggest companies review in areas of talent shortage? Companies have a business need to identify strategies to fill those gaps. So maybe you can just highlight your answer there for us.
Yeah. So I'm going to focus on, for time's sake, I'm going to focus on that there's a talent shortage gap in a particular area, because you all are HR folks. Maybe we'll focus on the wonderful people that deal with, the employee side of things. One of the things that I would start is what's the current state? So what is the experiences of the employees at your institution that are in those roles? And again, I walked through the list of things that you could start to think about. And just you can look that through your data. You can do qualitative analysis and research and ask them questions, right? A focus group and type of things, just to get a baseline of what's our experience there. Because spoiler alert, we know recruitment, marketing, the most effective way is word of mouth. So if you're not having a great if your employees are not having a great experience, they're not going to recommend their friends, their people in their network to come work for you. So that's part one. What's the employee experience? The second one is, what is happening in the landscape? That's super important. So is this something unique to your organization? Or is it something that's happening across the landscape? Maybe there is not as many folks that are doing this type of work anymore, or whatever. But that helps you ground in the reality of the data, which then will help you with the third step, which is what is your future state? How are you recruiting? What are your efforts? Do you need to shift based on what you found out in 1 and 2? And so I think that that's super important. And we often make decisions based on initiative. So for example, we're just going to start a new pipeline with this company and organization or this college. And one of the things I always say is, what is that grounded in? What data are you making that decision based on, right? We don't just start new initiatives because they sound fun, but more so, what is it grounded in? And so that would be one of the recommendations for just how you might approach looking at talent shortages within your institution.
I love it. And before we run out of time, Serena was asking, and Sienna, I'd love to throw this over to you. How can organizations ensure that employees are genuinely interested and engaged when it comes to implementing these initiatives? And I was thinking of you because, of course, like we're a remote team at Power to Fly. A lot of companies are hybrid. You've got some people in the office, some people are online. It's very hard to keep people engaged. So, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love this question, and I'm gonna share hard news. The worst thing we can try and do is make someone engaged when they don't want to be engaged, because it often has a reverse effect. And I think we've definitely seen that over the last few years. I want to share a story. So previously, before my role as VP of Growth at Power to Fly, I grew and I scaled our DEIB department where we partnered with a variety of organizations globally. One of the best stories that I've seen with the impact that we had is we were doing consulting and training with an organization. And this organization, their readiness and where they were at when they started was at about a 2. And their goal was to get to a 7. In order to do that work, a lot of the work that had to happen first was setting the foundation through a lens of why does this matter to everyone? So if you're working with, and whatever, I won't get into details of demographics, but let's say that you're working with a specific demographic and they might not necessarily know or understand why inclusion is important, or that perspective of what diversity means might be very level 1.0. When you're able to make it make sense on the why, then it allows for individuals to want to show up and engage. And again, it's like I just keep going back to very simple examples. If I were to ask the 54 people in this room right now, how many of us are left-handed? Feel free to raise your hand if you're left-handed in this room. Odds are there will be 1 to 3 people out of 53. And I'm seeing none so far. If I were to ask the rest of us, how many of us think about what it means to be left-handed on a day-to-day basis? Odds are the people who raise their hand know someone who is left-handed and has seen the impact that that has in swiping their Metro card. I'm originally from New York. Swiping their Metro card, playing the guitar, writing in school, et cetera, et cetera. And so there are things that are realities, then they say, oh, I get it. I might not necessarily be in those shoes, but I now understand why it's important to think about neurodivergence, why it's important to think about disabilities, why it's important to think about, I'm watching time, but why it's important to think about so many different lived experiences. And so something that I would say, Serena, specifically to you is, how can we make it matter to individuals, but then also how can we bring it back to the golden rule of treat others in the way that you would want to be treated, right? And so thinking through that of a lens of not making it a mandate specifically, but being able to say, how are we creating a workforce and an experience where individuals want to work with you, within your team, and within your organization? And so we were able to see that there's actually a 94% increase in the sentiment of belonging once individuals went through trainings in regards to inclusion practices that led to that organization increasing their pipelines and diversity within the organization, increasing the retention, sorry, remembering, increasing the retention in the organization and the tenure as well, and actually winning an award to then being a great place to work because you start with those foundations and you make it so that others care. So we're at 1 minute, so I'm gonna stop there, but hopefully that helps with a little bit of insight in regards to really making sure that individuals can connect with empathy in regards to the work as well.
Yeah, I think that's a great place to end it. So thank you so much, Sienna. Thank you, Celine, Rachel, and June. This was wonderful. Feel free to connect with our speakers on LinkedIn. I'm sure they would love to hear from you if you have follow-up questions. I also want to thank our amazing partner, Camille Wright and HRABC, a affiliate of SHRM, for helping put all of this together. We could not have organized this without them. So feel free. There's Camille. So feel free to reach out to them as well for more information. Thank you for spending your Tuesday afternoon or morning or evening, wherever you are in the world with us. We will share this recording with you in the coming days, so please check your inbox for that. And you can always go to powertofly.com. Oh, someone's calling me. It's powertofly.com for more information to find out about more events, including our Reach recruit and retain B2B summit that we're hosting next week. So I think everyone in the room might really love that as well. So thank you so much. We'll see you at the next event and have a great rest of your week. Bye.